Okay, good evening, everybody. And welcome to the second annual Dr. and Mrs. Harold Greer Lecture. I'm Dr. Rocio Gomez, an assistant professor in the Department of History of Virginia Commonwealth University. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Erika Edwards as tonight's speaker. This lecture is made possible with the generous support of the Greers, as well as the VCU Department of History. Before we begin, I would like to pass along the date of another upcoming lecture. VCU's History's own George Monroe will be the featured speaker at the Society of Cincinnati lecture on Tuesday, October 27th from 5:30 p.m. to 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. The title of Dr. Monroe's lecture is Revolutionaries America's Quest for a Russian Ally. You can find information on this lecture in the weeks ahead on the VCU History Department website. Now on to the main event. Dr. Erika Edwards is an associate professor of Latin American history at at University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Her research centers on the Black experience in Argentina and has been supported by fellowships from the American Association of University Women and the Ford Foundation. Tonight's lecture focuses on Black and African-descended women who actively partook in the construction of racial identities during the 18th and 19th centuries in Cordoba. Drawing from her recently published book, Hiding in Plain Sight, Black Women, the Law, and the Making of a White Argentine Republic, Dr. Edwards' research advocates for a relearning of Argentina's Black past and the origins of anti-Blackness. Her research is already shaping a new historiography for discussions of race in Argentina. Without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Edwards.
So first of all, I want to thank VCU, the History Department, and Rocio for this invitation. And also just in general, I mean, you invited me back in the spring and then it was up, down, up, down. I'm so happy it ended up working out. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
With that, I'm gonna go ahead and quickly share my screen so we can go ahead and get into this lecture. Okay, so again, thanks for this opportunity. And I'm going to go ahead and present my talk, Hiding in Plain Sight, Black Women in the Making of a White Nation. So I think one of the unique opportunities I had while I was writing the book was to actually see it in action. And I think that's one of the things that for those of us that do the colonial period, sometimes we don't get that opportunity. But picture it. It was 2014 and it was Argentina versus Germany in the World Cup final. Bets were made, ideas of who was going to get the last goal, was Messi going to do his thing, all this was swirling. But what captured my attention was the question that many people threw out there, which was, how is it possible that all the other South American teams have a Black player, Germany has a Black player, and Argentina does not have one single Black player? It was featured, that question was featured on the Huffington Post. It was also featured in The Root. Henry Louis Gates Jr. also wrote about it. And I literally jumped in my seat when I was reading this and I said, yes, I think I have the answer, please. So it's one of those opportunities, again, studying something that's 200 years ago and being able to actually provide a solution or a scenario to explain why a country such as Argentina, which prides itself in its whiteness, and I stress ness, being very European, very an exception to the rule. But if you look at some of these players, I hope you can see my cursor, excuse me, you can see phenotypically, especially this one, number 2, it does not look phenotypically white, or at least how we would describe them in the United States. Even the goalie here, right? Oftentimes they would be described as morochos, but yet somehow that is kind of covered under the cloak that Argentina is a white country, and thus the celebration of whiteness has become ultimately the national narrative. But I still question, is a Black Argentine possible? And that's really what I you know, in the midst of this, I said, this is where I'm going to go specifically with my book. So I shifted gears to deal just with that question. And one of the things that I found was, okay, to be fair, I can see how this continues to be somewhat of a true statement, right? That there are no Blacks in Argentina. You constantly would hear that. I mean, based off of my research in 1778, 30% of the population was of African descent. That included the labels negros, mulattos, free and enslaved throughout the Rio de la Plata. But then we have, by 2010, excuse me, with the most recent national census, that population in which they asked if you are of African descent was less than a percentage. So if you were to just look at the census data, you would say, okay, yeah, it might be potentially this very white country, and respectfully so. However, for me, how do you get from 30% to less than 1%? And so thus I continue to look at and understand what was happening to create this national narrative of whiteness. And in order to do that, I chose two directions. One, I decided to go west to Cordoba, and 2, I decided to focus on her. So with that, I want to start with Cordoba, a beautiful city, one that is oftentimes juxtaposed with Buenos Aires, and oftentimes it's considered to be more conservative, more traditional than Buenos Aires that is today, and of course, definitely during the colonial period. So why Cordoba? Well, to be frank, it wasn't Buenos Aires. And what I found vis-a-vis the historiography is that when explanations or questions or writings about the Black experience were published, the majority of them dealt with Buenos Aires, and in many respects still do. And so Buenos Aires has unfairly become the national conversation about race. It is the capital city. It does have half the population, but what about the other half? And that's important as we continue to understand how race is created. We must consider various socioeconomic situations and cultures that will impact how labels come about, and more importantly, how people respond. So the other decision I decided to make when looking at Cordoba was to go back a little bit further in time. So rather than focus on the late 19th century, again, this is the watershed moment that many focus on in terms of blancamiento and the whitening process. I thought, okay, so how do you actually get there? What has a republic, nation in process, decide that its quote unquote final solution is this importation of European immigrants as the only means or ways in which to become modernized? It doesn't happen overnight. And so that's where Cordoba again ended up being a really good case study to look at that process as well beyond Buenos Aires. So I just want to very briefly just ask that you just look at this map here, because this map is about 7 by 10, 7 by 10 blocks, excuse me. And this is the original map that was created in 1577. And what also made me want to continue with Cordoba is that essentially from 1577 to the mid-19th century, Cordoba stays roughly about the same size. So we're looking at, but in 1778 with the first census, about a population of roughly 7,000 people in the city. And by the 1840, 1850, the city has only grown to about 13,000. So that's another reason that I said this is a really good opportunity to explore a different Afro-descendant experience. And then lastly, one of the reasons why I chose it is when I finally went to the archives, it was an untapped treasure. So I was so excited about that. And because of its size, I was able then to cross-reference the lives of my characters that I discuss in the book and that I'm going to discuss shortly. And that's also what made it a very exciting find. So lastly, before I move on, I just wanted to highlight these two photos in the corners. This one here is the Cabildo. The other one is the cathedral, both of which are located here on the map. And this is the Plaza Mayor. And I would oftentimes walk about, well, today it's been about 4 or 5 miles, blocks from the archive, and I would sit in front of both the cathedral and the Cabildo. Of course, they've been built on since the 16th century, and it just amazed me how colonial in many respects Cordoba's downtown area still is today. So that was the one choice that I made. The other choice I made was to focus on her. And this is where I always enjoy giving a shout out to Ebony Magazine, who journalists wrote this article, Argentina, Land of Vanishing Blacks, in 1976. This is about 4 years before George Reed Andrews wrote his book. And so in many respects, I would argue that this is one of the pioneering studies for us, at least in the Anglophone US side, in terms of understanding and knowing about the Black experience in Argentina. This is actually 3 sisters that are being highlighted, and ultimately, it goes on to discuss why this population is becoming smaller. But again, I just wanted to highlight how these 3 sisters have the beautiful brownness. The phenotypes are on display, from chocolate to caramel to vanilla, right? So I just put this up there also to highlight her experience and what she then brings also to the conversation of understanding why or how Argentina becomes part of this or develops this and embraces this whiteness. So first and foremost, I think one of the ways in which what I really liked is that by focusing on her, I was able to very quickly dismiss this old myth of her being a victim. There are no Black men left because of these wars that killed them all. And so you have this miscegenation that happens that quickly I found was not the case. And that is also the advantage of going prior to the wars of independence to see how she is navigating these realities. The other thing that I found very important to do was then, well, where is she, right? And that had to be then the focus. She, in this gendered economy of labor of economy, she is part of the domestic sphere. And thus the household had to become the focal point. And again, I want to highlight then Michelle McKinley's work, which really helped me to see her in action. In particular, her idea of the economy of emotion and focusing more on levels of intimacy that go beyond just the sexual aspect, right? That to me was key as I started to read the various sources that I collected, various court cases, baptismal records, marriage records, and notarial and probate records. And what I found is, you know, to paraphrase her, is that intimacy is not just within the bedroom per se as in a sexual form, but it's also formed by soiled bed sheets. So I want us to think about how that works out. I mean, and what I think she was getting at, and this is what I really grabbed hold of, is that vulnerability that also takes place within the various levels of power dynamics at play constantly within the household. To have someone take care of you in that way, which I'm sure for many may have been very embarrassing, she was part of that. And so we cannot forget those moments of vulnerability as also being a part of those intimate acts that did assist in her seeking various ways and strategies to better her life and that of her children. So the other thing I want to stress too is what a most recent book came out, a recent book that came out by Jessica Johnson. I just finished it. I had my students read it just a couple weeks ago. And I also I'm finding that our works engage quite nicely because of how she discusses freedom and these developments of kinship that happens. And also the not so easy choices that are made, but choices that are necessary based off of the choices, and I stress, that are given to them. Okay, so that also moves us beyond just wishing that they could have done this. No, this is the reality of what Cordoba, Argentina in the 18th century was, and these were the choices that she had, and she decided in many respects to move forward in seeking levels of whiteness. Sometimes that's hard to swallow, but that is the reality of what some African descended women chose to do. Lastly, one other aspect that I really I saw when I worked with her was how to engage citizenship differently. Citizenship is often a masculine trope and notion, especially during the 19th century with the wars of independence, and one in which many of the scholars and historians have also taken hold of to discuss the disappearance of the Black population. And I said, you know, but where is she at? So again, we're taking this notion of the domestic sphere, and I want to bring that also to the Republican period. So post war period, and also the recreating of what is in Cordoba, and see that she still plays a very active role, even if it's oftentimes hidden in plain sight. But she is very much part of creating these citizens, and at times very much in tandem with what various state agents want to see out of this growing free population. So those are the two choices I made and why I've made those choices. So as I continue this talk, then I'm just going to go ahead and highlight these various roles, whether they were concubines, wives, mothers, or daughters, and how they assisted and helped and molded to create a white Argentina. So the first one is concubines. And oftentimes with concubines, one of the things I found very quickly is that they were in tension with the law, i.e. cohabitation was illegal in Cordoba, but yet somehow everybody was doing it. And so I ended up stumbling on this gem of a court case that I'm still working myself through the actual court case. It's so long and so juicy at times. But I came across a woman named Bernabella Villamonte, and her story is ultimately a love affair with a priest, and this love affair takes place for over 10 plus years. And one of the things that I just could not get over with is how much he put at risk for her. So clearly there is a relationship that goes beyond just the sexual. In the end, he gets threatened with excommunication because of this affair that he just will not let go of. What I also find very interesting when I looked at Bernabella, and again, because of the fact that it was such a small city, I was able to find her in other places, is that when this priest, his name is Don Jose Lino de Leon, bought her, he also bought her child. But Bernabella was already very strategic in how she was maneuvering, because I found the child's baptismal record, and I found that she was able to remove her from the book of Casta baptisms and put her in the book of Spanish baptisms. It just had her name. It did not mention the father. So already we're looking at someone who clearly is looking at ways to better her life, and especially that of her child. I mean, essentially she made it so that her child now, without doubt, will always be considered white. So as I continue to work this case forward, and again, noticing the various levels of intimacy, what I found also was that he very much supported her transformation. And what I mean by transformation is eventually what we'll find, or what I found, is that she went from being his slave to being his senora, in which he demanded other slaves also call her senora. What also I think was important to this aspect, and I must stress, is that she was noted for being the color of a Spanish woman. So already her proximity to whiteness was there. So it just needed a little bit more to cross over. And so this emulation that she had, oftentimes, again, breaking another law, sumptuary law, and wearing gold and wearing silver and wearing silks, was actually not just an individual choice, but rather this priest's decision to support her transformation. Again, understanding how these concubines, and this is an exceptional case, but in general, the ability for their lover to support them and move them forward, I think, cannot be ignored. And her ability then to capitalize on it, at least until they were caught, was also extraordinary. So that's one example of this moving towards whiteness that would happen. But a more permanent and safe way to seek this whiteness, of course, would be marriage. But I have to highlight something that is so interesting, again, as I was able to cross-reference all these courses, all these cases, is I did find that this priest, even though he was very much involved with Bernabella, he still knew to do his job. And what do I mean by that? So as we talk about wives, one thing I need to stress, a little bit of context, is that there was a law called the Royal Pragmatic that came forward that ultimately wanted to curb unequal marriages at the end of the 18th century. And so what I did was I gathered then these cases that actually appealed that idea. What do I mean? So very briefly, the law, for example, says that children under 25 must have their parents' permission before they can get married. If not, the parents could deny the marriage. However, the law gave a little caveat in which it said that if they find that the pairing is just, the couple, the betrothed, could then take their parents to civil court and ultimately fight for their right to get married. And so I looked at those specific cases, the marriage dissent cases, as they're called, in which you have these couples now going against their parents to say, no, we want to get married. And specifically what I looked at were these appeals in which a woman had been accused of having mala sangre, or African descent. And so what are the ways in which that she could then find or prove that she was not Afro-descendant ultimately? Back to Don Jose Lino de Leon. As I mentioned, he's sleeping with and having this amazing affair in which he's creating this Singora, but when it's time for him to perform his priestly duties, I found him in a court case in which he made it very clear that they were unequal, and as a witness said they should not get married. So again, this hypocrisy of going back and forth, how he can do both, I think is very telling in general of the ways in which the power dynamics constantly operated, one publicly versus one that is privately. So looking at these marriage dissent cases, as I mentioned, then the objective for a lot of these women was to prove that they did not have mala sangre. And in most cases, what I found was that most of them went forward and ultimately proved vis-a-vis various witnesses that they had, or they were Spanish. But what I found quite shocking was that there are also cases in which they were accused of having mala sangre, but rather than claiming they were Spanish, they instead now claimed they were Indian in order to, again, find a way to get married. And so that was the case with Manuela Arrieta, in which she was initially accused of having this blackness, and she said, you know, ultimately paraphrasing, no, I'm not. I am a descendant of noble Indians. And part of the reason why is one, the law allowed for Indians to be, the law being the Royal Pragmatic, allowed for Indians to be considered distinguished Spaniards. And two, I believe for those that could not phenotypically pass as being Spanish women, now found another way to, again, strategically marry who they wanted. In most cases, it was often a Spanish man. So what this also did was really, again, almost make me celebrate the fact that I chose Cordoba, where we see a little bit more of this indigenous and Black interaction, and especially in these cases. That to me was very telling of a very colonial society, and one in which, again, people were constantly in contact with each other. And this back and forth was always there in this small, quaint city, a very conservative city, however. So what I really enjoyed then about looking at these marriage dissent cases was that then I would go on and I would find that they would actually were able to get married. And what we find in some of those cases in which I looked at intermarriages is that some women could be born, as I would find in the archives and the census data, a slave and noted as being negra. But then as she slowly but surely climbed the social ladder, especially with her husband, who are oftentimes foreign Spaniards that had recently arrived and or Portuguese. In one case, for example, Teresa Soledo, she went from being a negra to a mestiza, and then a mestiza. Eventually, the last place I found her, she was then a doña. So it's clear that marriage allowed for more of a permanent and secure avenue to achieving whiteness. But getting back to this indigenous aspect, I think that also allows us to see and understand that whiteness has a bit of browning also to it. And more studies need to then look at this transition from Black to Indian. And that's something that, I found quite fascinating because I was studying Cordoba. And this issue of and question of becoming and taking on an Indian identity came forward again during the Republican period, in which I found that these freedom process is very much engendered. So one of the ways in which I saw this, and this was very different than Buenos Aires, is that a law from 1542 in which it declared that Indians were free and Blacks could be enslaved. Well, the law doesn't say that, but we know that the Blacks could be enslaved, continued to be utilized during the Republican period in Cordoba. So one of the things I found vis-a-vis a court case was Maria Guerra, and this court case actually began in 1809 and it finished in 1817. She was endangered of being enslaved. What had happened was that she argues her patron had died and his kids now were coming to claim her, and ultimately said that this was his slave. She countered and said, no, I've worked in this house, but so has my, grandmother who came from the Pampas, and I am Indian. What's significant is that because Indians were declared free, and freedom and children took on the status of their mothers, that ultimately meant that despite that her grandmother being, 2 generations ago in that family, the freedom had passed on through generations. This is what she was arguing. In the end, the court agreed, okay? And so what we find, or I found, is especially in this case, she goes from the potential of being a slave to a free Indian, and that's how she's described. She not only receives this freedom, but her children and her grandchildren also do, because, again, of this maternal link. This is something I found very interesting for Cordoba, because also during this time frame, what came forward in the Rio de la Plata is the Free Womb Act of 1813. I did not find contested freedoms in regards to that. In fact, in the census data, you don't even really see the use of liberto, which is the label given to the children, for a long time. In fact, in general, I did not find that label really being used in the civil secular sources. I did find that, however, in the baptismal records. So but I did not find any court cases such as like what I found with Maria Guerra, in which she was ultimately fighting for her freedom because she feared this enslavement. So freedom then becomes a very important aspect during the 19th century, and especially with the coming of the wars. And as I mentioned before, you have the Free Womb Act that came out in 1813, the year prior. You have the end of the slave trade. You also have the end of tribute. So you're starting to see a freer society develop. This is significant, however, because despite having a freer society, governing authorities still did not think that this largely invisible Afro-descended population was really ready for freedom. So what we find then is the important role of daughters and their role in terms of uplifting the next generation. That became very significant especially in 1811, when I found that the one public school for girls actually opened up a classroom for parda girls. Okay, so in this case with Bernardina, excuse me, in 1816, what I also found was that her freedom was tied to her going to that school. So in her manumission papers, her former owner said essentially, you go to this school and you will have your freedom. And she went, and eventually she became free. But it's again this notion that she's not quite ready as a child, but still not quite ready to understand the responsibility of freedom. This is also important because the school was meant to create now these Republican mothers. So it's important to stress that these mothers were not just Spanish or formerly Spanish or what we now call Blanca mothers. All mothers played a role in creating a more moral, civil, and loyal society. That is what is key. So very briefly, what I want to show you, this is actually the museum that still exists today. The school is still in operation, and it is one of those situations where I was dumbfounded to realize that the kids are still playing literally right next to the museum. So what you see is you have a typical bed. This would be an organ where they would learn how to play that, and of course the kitchen. This was of course divided. So you had those that were white honorable orphans who stayed on the grounds versus those that were poorer and known as the part of the external class that would commute. And then they created an additional class, a segregated class, just for pardas. And pardas, the label in itself also is indicative of the oncoming of institutionalized whitening. This is important to stress because, again, we're not just going to jump from blancamiento one day, or we're not going to just become blancamiento one day. Whitening just doesn't happen. Instead, it is a slow process that began at the beginning of the 19th century, and you see this vis-a-vis the creation of schools and the attempt by governing authorities. And I want to stress in this case, it was the church. And that also makes Cordoba very unique, is that we have the church becoming a very important agent in Cordoba versus in Buenos Aires. For the 1820, you're starting to see that the church does not have as much political power. So this continues until 1858. As you can see, from 1811 to 1858, they have this school for pardas. And it is also an important thing to stress that in 1853, you see the abolition of slavery. So they still have 5 more years of this external class that exists. I think that is important, again, to really see this transition over time, seeing how, again, the household and her story becomes very integral and understanding the movement towards whiteness in Argentina. And it's important to, again, focus on the fact that whether they're concubines, wives, mothers, or daughters, they did participate in making a white Argentina. So thank you very much. I will now switch to off the sharing. Oh, okay. Let me go ahead and put that down. Put that down. Okay, and I'm going to turn on the light because I noticed it got dark. So I do apologize.
No worries. Okay, so we now have a great opportunity to ask Dr. Edwards any questions that you may have regarding her presentation. You should see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A, and you should be able to see a place to type in a question. So if you type in your questions there, we will bring up the different questions. We unfortunately might not have time to get to all of them, but we hope that you will ask any questions on the research process, and maybe just what research is like in Argentina as well. So we'll open up the Q&A. And while people are typing their questions, Erika, I have one for you. So one question I had listening to your conversation and your discussion regarding these fascinating cases is the question of honor, and how those honorifics of señora and doña, how those informed your research, and what sources and what other literature in Latin American history supported that analysis.
So I think right away, what shocked me is the use of doña, especially doña, in the 1813 census. And I said, wait a second, this is 3 years later. Why are we still using don and doña? I mean, the Spanish is not a good thing, right? This is not so, but we're supposed to be this new republic. And so that really helped me to see the difference, the regional difference between Cordoba and Buenos Aires. Not that I'm not familiar with the Buenos Aires census, but at least thinking in terms, because you have this growth of the independence movement coming forth from Buenos Aires. You have the counter-revolution in Cordoba, and then to find that they're still holding on to that really shocked me. So that's when I really started to put more of an emphasis on just when I would see the title Doña. And then the other way in which I think it helped me to inform me is when I would read these court cases, and I would see the way that it could be so easily applicable to all these Spanish women, but then kind of you could see it in Doña this and then Mercedes that, you know, it'd be such a contrast. I think that's what also helped to really inform that I was working on something. So when I did see her transition into Doña, that's when it was really a moment where I said, she has officially become a Spanish woman. And for me, it's most of the idea of honor and such really comes from Lyman Johnson's book that he wrote a few years ago, the edited the anthology. I can't think of who it was with right now, but yeah, that's the book that really helped me to understand honor at the various levels. Also Susan Sokolow's, 1989 Sexuality and Sex in Colonial Latin America, but her specifically was dealing with the marriage dissent cases, and that's one of the things I also wanted to build on. So those were the main two that specifically spoke to the Rio de la Plata.
Wonderful, thank you. My colleague, Antonio Espinosa, asked a question along the similar lines. He, in particular, as a historian of education, he is curious about other examples of education as a mean of whitening as appropriated by people of African descent in Argentina.
Wow. So, you know, it's so interesting because I stumbled on this very last minute, and I was so excited to even find this orphanage that had existed, and let alone to have this information. I'm only familiar with San Miguel, that also took place, and this is in Buenos Aires. But by the 1820s, it no longer exists. It then opens up to the Benefit Society that takes hold of it. So you also see that the church is no longer part of that conversation anymore. At this point, those are the only two examples that I have.
Thank you. Cristina Proenza Coles asks, can you speak to how whiteness and citizenship are linked to in Argentina compared to how they are intertwined in the US? Do you see similarities or differences?
Yeah, I think whiteness and citizenship are very much part of the same conversation. And many times I think when the use of being a, as they would call it, ciudadano came forward, it was always with this imagined notion of a white male. So in that respect, that's very similar to the United States, in which being a citizen, having those legal rights, those voting rights, for example, was very much attached to being a man and very much attached to whiteness as well as class, because clearly you had to have levels of money to vote. So definitely I see the parallel examples, especially throughout the 19th century. In Cordoba, for example, what they did for these Black men, even though they said they were citizens, they had to be able to show, for example, that they were 4 generations out of slavery just to run for office, right? And 2 generations out of slavery, 2 generations of freedom just to vote. So it's definitely there. And I think you'd find very similar notions in Black codes in the United States.
Thank you. So John Mandel asks if you found any parallels in Argentina with Chica de Silva, that in the sense that they are mythologized and the way she's upheld in not only film and music, but also in a telenovela.
At this point, no, I do not think that there's someone comparable yet. However, I think Bernabella has potential, and so I am definitely going to keep working with her. We do have Maria Remedios de Valle, who is now coming forward, and she is the woman who was also a captain in the army during Independence Wars. A very, very courageous story of her being shot 6 times and such. But clearly that is a different story and narrative of national attention than Chica de Silva or possibly Bernabella.
Thank you. Catherine Burdick is especially interested in what advice you have those who are studying for the first time colonial records regarding enslaved peoples in Latin America, in this case, Chile, and what are some of the key themes and questions that might be important insights?
For studying enslaved people, and then specifically in Chile, one of the things I would say, and this is what I did when I was going there, just trying to still find some information, is be open to any and everything. Because what I was shocked to find out about Cordoba is they have so many archives. And archives I didn't even think about, but they have an archive for the municipality. They have an archive for the university that was founded in 1613. They have their own little archive. Of course, the church has their archive. I found out that this museum has an archive in which, you know, I found this information about these Black girls. So be open to going everywhere and just for the heck of it, say, you know, I just want to see if there's anything there. And then when you get in there, take everything. If you're allowed to use your camera, take as much as possible. I remember, this is something one of my mentors had taught me, is, you know, when you go into the archives, get as much as you can. So when I was still doing my dissertation on a good day with a tripod, I would take up to 2,500 photos. On a bad day without the tripod, I was taking 1,200. But I literally said, I'm looking for anything that says negro or mulatto. I'll figure it out later what it means, if I can use it or not. So that's what I would say. Be open and flexible and ready for anything you can find. I mean, me just going to Cordoba was just that attitude. Why not?
So access to ecclesiastical records and notarial records are fairly uneven throughout Latin America. So in the archives where you visited in Cordoba and in the National Archives in Buenos Aires, did you have any problems with access regarding church records in particular?
No. And I found out that that was because the director had changed. And so I was lucky to come during that moment, and she's still there, and she's amazing. And thank you, Selene, for that access. Still to this day, Donnie, Marcella, thank you, thank you, thank you for that access, because I heard that, you know, before her, they didn't. And just to show how much it changed, but the university archives, they said no. And then luckily it changed, and then I had access to it, and unfortunately now it changed back, so now I don't. But you know, it's about these flexibilities of working in Latin America, very much dependent on the director and what he or she wants to allow access to.
It's all depends on what mood the bureaucracy is
That
in.
too, that too, that's, yes.
So my colleague Brooke Newman is asking, in cases where women claimed indigenous descent in order to marry and or avoid enslavement for both themselves and their current and future children, did local authorities attempt to access documentation or witness accounts to prove these claims? And correct me if I'm wrong, Brooke, but it sounds like she's asking the type of evidence that was used in these court cases.
Right, and that's a great question. And the answer is yes. So oftentimes they would talk about how they would go out and seek the baptismal records, right? Because that, I'm finding, was the key to legally cementing, in quotations, but to try to at least cement a permanent label is to go back to the baptismal records. And so they would attempt to do so. In some cases, they could never be found. In other cases, they would find that, yes, indeed, this person was actually of indigenous descent. So yes, there was constantly an attempt to do that. And another thing that I found that was very interesting is it was also used by the children, the male children, by boys, excuse me, yeah, boys that were now men, and claiming that their mother were also indigenous, right? And in his case, he actually could not prove it because he argued that he was taken along with his mother from the Pampas, and eventually, you know, they were Christianized, but where are the baptismal records? You know, that's something that was mysteriously disappeared. So there were attempts to get it at times. Yes, it was proven, but I would say most of the time it became very fickle about where exactly that information was. But, oh, and just to add on, Brooke, because that's a really good question, one of the ways in that they would go about trying to prove it is saying where that they were from, like La Toma, which was a part of a predominantly indigenous area in Cordoba, or that they were a cacique, or somebody in their family was a cacique, or they would talk about how they dressed in order to try and move that conversation towards them being indigenous.
Thank you. I think along those lines, Maya Minter is asking if you could speak to or direct us to research that looks at the Black male experience in the whitening of Argentina.
Sure. I mean, the most recent would be Alex Baruch's from Shipmates to Soldiers. He allows to at least discuss, he does more Montevideo, but it's within the Rio de la Plata would be one person. Another person would be Alejandro Alejandro Frigerio, not De La Fuente, Frigerio. He's an Argentine-based scholar, anthropologist, who's also written about it. You also have Martha Goldberg, who has written about it. But what I can do is actually suggest you read my article, Slavery in Argentina, where I list a bunch of sources and the Oxford bibliographies that go into that more.
Thank you. So one of the best undergraduates that I've had, David, has a question, and he says that even though you've talked about the legal process and the process of whitening, how were people treated?
I'm sorry.
What was the treatment like?
You kind of went out for a second. What was the question?
Oh, let me see. So David asked how women were treated and what was their social level and living conditions after the process of whiteness.
Well, at this, I don't really go beyond what happens once they become Spanish, but I could project that their lives definitely got better. Now that they were permanently considered to be a doña, you know, the privileges in which that are granted to her, for example, just even how she could dress, how she could present herself on the streets, something that seems very small and maybe minute in terms of a detail, but it's very much about when you think about the presentation and the reputation and what calidad, it constantly is on display and constantly in action. That's very powerful when you cannot do that. So something as small as that is very important. The fact that, you know, once they get married, they have those protections in terms of inheritance as well. So again, I don't go beyond what happens after they become Spanish, but I would project that their lives is definitely better.
Great, thank you. So Daniel Morales is curious about the fluidity of race and class. Was this a broader trend, or was it more of a particular circumstance on the periphery of empire?
No, I think that this is very indicative of what is happening throughout the Spanish Empire. I was able just to find how this flexibility and this process of I'm a mulata or mulata, no, I'm a zamba, maybe I'm, you know, negra, no, I'm not parda, all this going back, you know, at times a doña, actually has real consequences towards us understanding why Argentina is considered to be a very white nation today. So that to me is I guess the part that I think really highlights how this flexibility could lead to something bigger. And that's not saying that it didn't happen elsewhere, but Argentina does pride itself in being very much a white nation.
Mm-hmm. Let's see, any final questions? I'm going to give myself the final question. In that we have a lot of undergrads and graduate students that are mostly focused in the history of African American history. So are there any parallels in your research with the literature in US African American history?
So I'm not that familiar with the literature in African American history, especially for my time frame, but I can project that as Black women of the diaspora, I think one of the things that I find very exciting about this project is that it shows that despite the levels of discrimination and prejudices that existed, it's not going to stop a Black woman from moving forward. And I think that, you know, goes beyond borders and time and continues to be pretty much, very much our story, whether you are within the United States or you are in Argentina or Brazil or Colombia. That to me is very important. And also the strength that it takes for them to constantly put family as a focal point. And I didn't go into this, but one of the things that was so powerful with when I was reading some of these manumissions that were granted is that I kept finding pregnant Black women, African descended women, that had already paid 25 pesos for freeing their unborn child. And that to me is something else I think that is very matriarchal about being a Black woman, especially 18th, 19th century, and I think continues that conversation today. our importance and our willingness to do what we need to do for ourselves and especially for our children.
Thank you. And on that powerful note, I'm going to end this year's Greer Lecture, and I want to thank once again Erika Edwards for joining us. And thank you again for that remarkable talk and great insight into not only a research process, but research that's very much needed.
Thank you so much. And thank you again for this opportunity, VCU, the History Department, and of course, Rocio for the invitation. Thank you so much.
Un placer.